Hello.
Hi, Benoit.
Hey.
How you doing?
Hey everyone, let's get started. Let me just share my screen. So last week was a pretty small meeting, and we were talking mostly about early execution versus deferred execution. And I guess besides that, I had, since we decided on the payload format, I updated it. I put it in, I moved it out of that gist and into the GitHub discussions to see if anyone else had any thoughts. Haven't heard any feedback from there yet. And I went through a bunch of the old discussions that we had and marked a lot of them resolved, most of the ones around duplication, response explosion, all the stuff that the new payload format addresses. Yeah, and then we talked about this early execution versus deferred execution. And I kind of want to continue this discussion a bit. And I think that I will probably add it to the agenda of the next working group meeting, the primary one that's on, when is that? That is next week, next Thursday, July 6th. So we can get wider input. But yeah, and so background on that is early execution means that when you have fields that are deferred, we start executing them right away or with some amount of delay, like waiting a run loop tick or something similar. And basically like writing the spec from the perspective that things are going to be executed as they're encountered, with implementations allowed to have a delay of any amount before deferred stuff starts getting executed. Whereas deferred execution means that you don't even start calling the resolvers of deferred fields until all of the non-deferred fields in the same level have been completed. So their resolver is called, complete value called. So the whole tree is down there. And there are some reasons brought up of how, you know, you can have queues in your schema implementation. That means that by doing early execution, you could be slowing down your initial results. And the trade-offs there is that this could be extending the entire time of your query to be a lot longer than it would be without defer. Yeah, so that's a summary. I've been thinking about it over the past week, and I think that I'm still not convinced by deferred execution. I agree that all the things that we raised are potential pitfalls or issues, but I'm not convinced that like a globally enforced deferred execution is the right way to solve it, because it really feels like we're putting a penalty on like every schema implementer, every resolver, in case they do have these issues. But I feel like we could like provide tools that would solve these issues. Like I think that we could do implementation specific things, like put stuff in the data that we send to resolvers, so you know that a field's being deferred, have a way to await it, or have a way to set up separate queues based on that, something like that. I don't know, that's where my thoughts are right now. Yeah, I wonder, especially the Apollo folks, if you guys have thought about this at all. I don't think you guys were here in the last meeting.
Not on my side, at least. It's understand implementation can do whatever implementation wants, right? It can, like, for stuff like a couple of iterations, it makes sense to do early execution, because the whole environment is controlled. For like server implementation, like each implementation can decide. I'm just worried about first experience, like when somebody writes a like GraphQL server, or they migrate to a new version of like GraphQL.js specifically, and they discovered like surprising behavior, especially since like it's people have so much, like worst case scenario defer is useful, but at the same time it's weird to have like useless like feature and force people to like a way. Can we produce like some warning or something? If we produce the warning in case like stuff is locked, it would be ideal
Produce what?
solution. Warning like console log something saying.
Yeah, I'm
How
not
would
sure
we
how,
know?
like, yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, how would we know that something is held up by a deferred field? Because we don't know what's going on inside of the resolvers. They're not transparent, they're opaque.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, but what I'm worried about, it's hard, like these issues are hard to debug, hard to discover. And it will basically create, I'm worried that create a myth that defer is basically useless. There is no like difference. Or people will have like one article explaining this issue. So for me, it's like surprising behavior.
But it really feels like we're like, yeah, I mean, I totally like understand that that like that's an issue that you can run into the first use experience. could be non-optimal, but it's like at the expense of that is like you're hindering like if like the users who are able to solve that, and right.
Yeah, I'm also worried. Worried. Like there is two big chunks for me. One chunk is that it's smaller one about surprising behavior. It's like non-debuggable. Like second, even worse thing for me is that this issue can be like produced by third-party code, and it's like people usually store more like third-party
And-
code is problematic if it's happening in third-party code. If it's like fully in your code, it's like one potential solution, especially since what we basically discovered is like people who want to take advantage of it and use it. Can we have like speaking about reference implementation, can we have like a flag or maybe like something when you specify resolver, you say like this resolver can be called with early execution. That will work for both cases, like people who starting with the servers or use like third-party code they don't have control over. They just like lose a bit of performance. And people who like sure that the whole implementation is not doing that issue, or who willing to take a risk, they can like set some flag on per field level.
Yeah, that's like the inverse. It's kind of like setting a flag. You would basically like the inverse of that was like what I had proposed, where you put something on resolve info. Benji said it could be like a promise parent defer that then you could await inside your resolver. And that's kind of like taking like the opposite approach. So, you know, it's early execution by default, but then where you do run into these issues, you can do this. Or I'm imagining like if you have like some code that you use to like make your database queries, and then you could make that smart enough that you could pass the resolve info to it, and it could make separate queues for if something's deferred or not, or it could like do the awaiting on its own, or so it's not necessarily you have to like flag something on every single resolver.
Okay, so it kind of make it better in a way that if people like, you know, like with angry users of open source saying like this library not work like for my case because I don't have control over like third-party legacy or something code, I cannot change it, and you should fix it in your library. At least like you can say to them like put this code in your resolver.
Yeah.
So this solves this part. Like what this doesn't solve is I expect like people, not everybody actually have ability to debug it and find out what happened, especially if it's in third-party code. And like the remaining problem is that there is no like clear path from I have like I don't have like defer is not deferring anything to that line. There is no like the only like journey you can go is like is a week of debugging, like days. Okay, like days, trying to understand what's happening.
But if these are like, if we have like documented, like these are the things that you need to be aware of when your server starts supporting defer. I mean, I don't think that everyone is going to be going completely from scratch. Because I mean, defer, like we've said from the beginning, that it's like something that has trade-offs, and it's not just like each when you're building like your server, and you start like when you start allowing it in your server, like you have to like, and you have to understand that there's trade-offs for using it. It makes the response larger. There's a bit more work for the server to do. And like clients should understand that. I don't know. I feel like is there a parallel here to like how like GraphQL like a naive GraphQL implementation could have like the n+1 problem, but we recommend data loader as like a way to do that. Like we gave you, like we don't like build the GraphQL resolvers in a way that make it impossible for n+1 to happen, because that would have too many trade-offs. But instead we say, here's a tool like data loader you could use to is there a an analog there?
Yeah, I think it's actually good analog here. So maybe like taking page from that book, and Jakob, you probably you muted, because previously there was echo through between your speaker and microphone. So like taking page from n+1 problem book, we need like solution. Yeah, and we need actually like thinking about that there is like two solutions. One solution is Yakov, like if you're willing to invest time and potentially redesign like some underlying code, you can use Yakov's priority numbers to implement like performance solution. If you want to ignore it, you can basically do with await as the first line of your resolver. So maybe it's worth. But like the minimum we can do is it should be like polished solution inside data, also inside data loader, and we need to education material, and this should be like part of API, both like priority numbers and something like this. I would call it maybe, if you think the only usage for that would be a solution to this problem, maybe call it not parent defer, but something more like more use case based, like work defer or something. Prevent early execution.
Yeah, and like I'm imagining like when you have like this stuff in Resolve Info, like if you do have like third-party code that is affected by this, you could wrap the third-party code in your own stuff that is able to manage it, right?
Yeah. What I'm talking, you can either do middleware, or you can do middleware is not that easy with ScrapKit.js. You can do it for external packages, but you have like some option to do something. That's why I'm with like Benja proposal is good enough. Like without it, the whole, I would say, strong no. After this change, I'm like, it's not, there is no like blocker for early execution. There is like downsides, but not a blocker. And I think on the main working group, we can discuss and see and get the temperature, like what people want, especially like what should be default behavior, like fast early execution or deferred execution. Because we agree that both should be like possible.
Yeah. Just reading Benji's message in the chat now.
Benji, I think that's a summary that I definitely agree with. In terms of the first, the pass criteria, the failure criteria, I'm not sure if you would, when, this is just a summary. In the second comment, are you commenting on like, once we provide methods to opt out of early execution and to, on a per resolver basis, to me that, provides sort of like the optimal granularity. I mean, even the default could be to opt out of early execution, but it would be there as a possibility. And so you could sort of have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I think giving users the way to opt into early execution would be the best, which is why explicitly I've said that we should allow early execution. It just isn't what the default should be. And I think broadly this comes down to, like Ivan was saying, it's that first expectation. Like people are going to upgrade to a new version of GraphQL that's going to have stream and defer. People are going to say, oh, okay, I understand what stream and defer is. I want this data sooner and this other data later. So I'm going to add defer to the stuff that I don't care about at first. And if that doesn't actually speed up their page load times, they'll just think, oh, this feature doesn't really work. And that'll be it. And I think because of, like you were saying, Ivan, with the third-party modules, like because we support arbitrary business logic and GraphQL is just a layer over arbitrary business logic implemented by any number of services, either locally or remotely, we cannot know if there are any queues there, either operating system queues that are in our own code, queues that are in remote services. We don't know. And so having the default behavior for this be essentially the early execution and potentially give this bad first impression, I'm not in favor of. That said, I do agree with Rob and Michael and various others that making it so that every GraphQL request that uses defer and stream takes longer just purely because we defer every execution is not completely desirable in itself. So I think for people that understand their systems, being able to opt into the early execution is wise, whether that be in a global across the whole schema with a flag, with then this opt out that we've discussed, like the resolve info.parent defer promise or something like that, or whether it be on a per resolver basis, which I think is less desirable. Yeah, there's definitely, I think there's a middle ground. But as much as anything, part of the question here is, what do we actually specify? Because the specification of early execution becomes quite complex comparatively because it separates execution from delivery in a way that the GraphQL spec doesn't really do currently.
Yeah, so I think I agree with all of with all of that, but maybe come down differently. Um, I think that for the reasons that you and Yvonne mentioned, I would having early execution be the default. I think without a broader understanding of its of the likelihood of impact, does seem sort of unnecessary. Power users who want to enable it, as long as they have the option, it would seem fine. And I think so. I think broadly, there's a lot of agreement that it would be good to provide it, that servers, to the options to users. I posted a comment in, I think I think it was on the issue, the discussion that you raised, Benji, where I think that we, if it's just a question of whether to specify it or not, and not a question of whether to have the option to provide it, I don't really see the downside of specifying it in terms of complexity. I mean, I think the fact that it's possible, and that we've proven it's possible with an implementation and with spec edits, so to whatever extent they've been, you call, the algorithm and the implementation of proof, but to whatever, the fact that we've shown that it's possible, sort of is a boon, and sure, it adds complexity, but isn't that something that the algorithms that we include in the specification, help people with, that help manage that complexity. So I feel like, considering that we have algorithms and we have a spec text and we have a reference implementation, if it's just a question of, well, one is simpler and one is more complex, I'm not really sure what advantage we have of not sharing the complex solutions we've discovered with those who want to implement them. I do think there might be a value of giving a more simpler algorithm as well, but I think it might be wise to even include both alternatives, maybe one in an appendix and one in the main text. But I'm not. Meaning, we seem to have basic agreement that it should be possible. That it's an option. It's an optimization that many might feel useful. So I feel like, in terms of specifying it, the downside of the additional complexity, is actually is sort of an upside. That we can help people with that.
Actually, like, I have idea, because we can go back and forth. What can help us is to put more info into the loop. Since first idea, since Facebook implemented stream defer years ago, a question is what they use. Facebook is like special case. They have like a huge monorepo, a huge monolith, and they like put a lot of investment. But at the same time, if we learn that they tried early execution, or like they use and switch to deferred execution, or for example, they like use deferred execution from the beginning and don't experience any problem because of it, it will give us additional info. So like,
Yeah, I can't say 100%, but just from my talks with them, it's been that they have just always done early execution. Things may have changed, but that was what I think that's what they're doing, but we should hear it from someone who knows more than I do.
Yeah, maybe they have some background. For example, they try delayed execution. It will put additional info in the loop. And second idea, remember we have like a couple occasions when we did a polls on Twitter. If I remember, one time I know for sure we did a poll when we introduced, discuss introducing daytime scalar. and we discussed like a name conflict. Champion for the Andy, I think, Lee or Andy, somebody did like a poll on Twitter, ask like, how do you want this color to be called? Because proposal back then was to call it offset daytime or something. And most people said, no, we actually like want it to be called daytime. So maybe we will ask what actually potential clients want, or people who will use this feature want. Like, and to make this question unbiased, like, don't put any numbers, just ask like what you expect initial response return as early as possible, and or you want it return as early as possible, but at the same time try to minimize like the whole execution of the whole query, potentially making it like initial response little bit late. I don't know how to describe it, but yeah, I think we can do a poll. If we don't go into technical detail, I don't think like we should describe what is early execution and like deferred execution, just formulated in a way that Benja formulated in his Zoom comments. You unmute, Yakov.
Yeah, the thing with Twitter polls, it's like I don't know, you may just get lots of responses of people who don't like fully understand the context, because it's like when it's like just for naming something, it's just kind of what you prefer, but like you may not fully understand like what the trade-offs are.
No, I think we can describe trade-off. Because there is initial part and deferred part. We can say like, do you want initial part to be as fast as possible and get deferred part a little bit later, or you want initial part to be like delivered a little bit slower, but your deferred part to be delivered like, because of that like a little bit faster.
But even that, like there could be other ways that you could have, like you could have them both be as fast as possible without, like, the deferred execution isn't the only way to do that. But anyway, yeah, we could think about it, about the right way to ask the question. But before that, I would like to get feedback from the bigger working group meeting.
Yeah, makes sense. One quick argument on the main group, when present like a switch as a solution, I still think it should be per field, a switch option or something, because synchronous, imagine you did like some synchronous calculation. You should not put like, especially in JavaScript, synchronous calculation in a main thread, but at the same time you can do some calculation, and you never want to call synchronous resolvers as early execution, right? There is like no reasons to do early execution for synchronous resolvers.
Synchronous resolvers, you could have, we're going to have other issues anyway. Like even if you are doing deferred execution with them, presumably your server has other requests coming in, and like whenever that synchronous resolver is getting executed, it's blocking everything else.
No, I mean like not what long resolvers, like milliseconds, like type of resolvers. It's not like you're not like running narrow network, but you like reading I don't know, like doing something. Something in between, something that previously people was okay with, not to move like to web worker, but now it's basically make initial response slower. It's not an argument of banning early execution. It's like example of why per field flag makes sense, because only the schema after knows what these resolvers do internally. Is it like, is it synchronous? Is it asynchronous? Is it like synchronous part? Is it like big or not? So I think if we give control to a user, it should be per field.
Going back to the spec. If we write the whole spec from with the assumption of deferred execution, then and we wanted to add a mode for early execution, that seems like it would be a lot of changes to go in that direction. But if you wanted
spec text change, we can just say in the spec text, if you want, you can do early execution. I would add it from day one. Like in environment, there you control all the code, and where you know what you're doing.
Yeah, but with early execution, when your server is implementing it, you have to also there's a few more cases you have to handle for error bubbling. That's basically the difference. But if you did write all that out in the spec and you wanted to have an option for deferred execution, it seems like it would just kind of be like a very small change to be like, because for early execution, I think we want to say like the server can have some amount of delay, but it would be like if you're doing this in like in deferred execution mode, you would just wait as long as like you would basically just like do that await in the spec as part of like the executing. You would do that before you call the resolver.
So Rob, I think here I kind of agree with Benji. I think the overall changes between early execution and delayed execution, you know, they start off with how to handle errors of null bubbling, but they also sort of impact how we actually do field collection. You know, do we have sort of like leftover fields? And there could be a whole host. Meaning, I've worked up some spec edits for early execution, and I think probably those could be improved in many ways. But if we were using delayed execution, I think it overall could be much simplified. And I think what Benji is getting at is that there's a certain beauty or even advantage in the simplicity. First of all, making sure, let's say, just making sure there are fewer errors, but maybe just making sure the spec is more extensible later on. I mean, I can see the advantages of simplicity, but I think if we go, if we start with early execution, if we start with delayed execution and then we want to make a change, it wouldn't be a breaking change, but there would be a large number of spec edits. And if we had early execution in the spec, as I have now in my proposal, we could support delayed execution in the spec, but it might be beneficial to those implementers who are only using delayed execution to actually have those simpler algorithms as well. So that's why I think even an appendix might, giving both alternatives might actually be very beneficial.
if we did only spec deferred execution, that does feel like it would be a breaking change to allow early execution because you could be using deferred execution with resolvers that have side effects and be relying on that, right? So
I don't think you're supposed to rely on the resolvers having side effects except with the mutations. I mean, some people might, but I don't. I mean, we can even add a note that that's still not a good idea. But that's not to say. I mean, I come out on the side that we definitely should specify early execution, and I think what would be important, or what I've gotten from these meetings, is a little bit of confusion as to what topic we're discussing, or not confusion, but just realization that there are two different topics. One is what should an implementation pursue, and should there be flags and so forth. And then the other question being, what should the specification specify? And I think there's basic agreement that there should be options and implementations, and very likely implementations will find it useful to enable early execution. And I think there's broad agreement there. And the only question is how exactly to have that reflected in the specification text. And it seems like opinions run the gamut from, we should specify delayed execution and just provide a simple note, that you can do early execution and good luck, good luck with the algorithms, or what I'm suggesting, good luck with the algorithms and maybe even check an appendix, or versus having the early execution algorithm in the main text, check the appendix for the delayed, versus only having the early execution in the main text. I mean, I don't think there's anyone here that thinks that some implementations might want to go with one or the other. I think we all realize that there are trade-offs. So the question is what to specify, and in that sense, like having a poll as to what to specify, would be a very different poll as to whether you want to do, have early or a very different discussion in the main working group. So I think we have to, when we present it to the main working group, maybe we want to either clearly present both questions or focus on one of them.
I'm just thought about interesting thing. So like, if Facebook uses early execution, so it means possible to do it on big scale without problems, with all asterisk that Facebook is have like engineers working on it full time and other asterisk. So we need to allow early execution anyway. What interesting thing here is like, it's easy to wrap early execution into deferred execution. So in your algorithms, you just like use a wait or something, but you cannot do it vice versa. So you cannot have algorithm for deferred execution and inside it implement like early execution. It's not possible. So
yeah, that was the point I was trying to make before.
So we discussing like, based on that, the reference implementation, if we think like use case is strong and people will implement early execution anyway, it's a job of reference implementation, not only like JavaScript main library in JavaScript ecosystem, but as a reference implementation. If you think like most of implementation will allow early execution, we should implement it. And if we should implement it, it means like GraphQL.js code should be like roughly equal to spec. So continue with thought chain Actually, I really like us to specify delayed execution. It make like stuff simpler for a person who just trying to understand how GraphQL works and go into spec and read it. But to be truthful to what you're describing, I think we should describe early execution by the bullet and describe early execution in the spec. Say, have like nodes saying, depending on environment for server, you can go either way as a default. Maybe have like some caution explaining that third-party code or like even OS level limits like HTTP connections or something else can create a problem. So you should wisely choose default. But yeah, if idea is that implementations, most of implementation will do early execution, it should be early execution in the spec.
Yeah, I think that was my conclusion as well. So I definitely like feel like I need to spend some time and like come up with like a good way to summarize everything so that we could present it to the bigger working group and have a productive discussion. So I'm going to work on that.
And maybe as an idea for you to, since Michael gave a strong argument to this case, to this discussion, and we use in conversation a lot, maybe he can summarize what user reported to him about early execution as like, because he had interaction with Facebook cases, case of one company.
Yeah.
He has understand he experienced like with users, multiple users about that issue.
And do you know what maybe from inside Apollo there's what I guess because they're already shipping defer too. And so I think if that's using GraphQL.js, that would be the currently implemented early execution, right? Is Apollo is shipping defer in a beta version or something, right?
Yeah, but I think if it's if it's in Federation, it's probably written in Rust. So I will ask in a group, but yeah, it's good idea in general to ask about what currently implemented. I think it would be early execution, but yeah, it's good idea to ask. Good suggestion, but yeah, I think this code is not dependent on GraphQL.js.
Okay. All right. I'm not going to be able to make next week's meeting. So I'm going to cancel it. Then the Thursday after that is the primary working group. So I'm going to add this to the agenda, and I'll try to work on coming up with a good way to present all the info that we discussed. Anything else? Any last thoughts for today?
Just one quick word on the power loader utility. That was a suggestion of Ivan's from last week to provide like sort of a parallel to data loader for people to start dealing with this right off the bat. What that does is it makes sure that to disentangle data loaders by sending deferred requests separately than the non-deferred, using the information that's exposed in the resolver. It doesn't solve a situation in which the whole deferred batch is sent to your endpoint earlier than your non-deferred batch and causes your endpoint to queue. So it doesn't solve that problem, but it does solve the entangling one. For the queuing problem, that's something you're not in control of. You would have to wait on disable early execution for that resolver. I think there can be some, again, I think if early execution is disabled by default, I think we can do some work on query planning, even in GraphQL.js, or probably as at least initially as a separate library that can actually create more complex and more accurate ways of optimizing this further, and making sure that you don't have to completely wait for the entire initial result to finish, just because the initial result may include something that might get blocked by your later result. For a query that's operation that's like stored in the reserver, like a stored operator, a persisted operation, we could get something much smarter in place. And I think once we get early execution in and like under a flag, I could start working on that.
Yeah, and this wraps around data loader. Or is it a fork of data loader?
This wraps around data loader. It's not a fork. So one aspect of that is it uses the same data loader and the same cache, and also the same connection. So there might be a different, basically, if you want to use different connections as a separate tool, then you're basically talking maybe about two different data loaders. So there is maybe some options maybe that to handle this somewhat differently, but this is just like a first proof of concept.
And so it'll use the same underlying cache, but it'll make sure that things from different priorities aren't queued together.
Yeah, exactly. It'll use the same cache, and that means that because they're not queued together, they won't be present in the cache at the same time, so that you may get the same item sent in two different batches, simultaneously, because they don't, neither one will be in the cache until they both come back. But they're never entangled, which is the the main problem that this was trying to solve.
Yeah, thank you for working on that. It's give arguments if it's like how hard it's to implement and how the whole story would look like. Since we're now in discussion phase and figuring out solutions should be like super polished, but when we decide, if we decide to go like allowing early execution, it should be like something from data loader, like back when we release it, to provide like coherent story to a person.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I took that suggestion and then I got some feedback from Benji in terms of data loader sort of being feature complete at present, and I guess it totally is for what it's worth. So, I mean, I guess it's you know, the question of whether the vision for the library, whether it should be in data loader or alongside it, maybe that's for Lee to tell us what more.
Strong argument, strong factor for that would be like, what is default behavior? If default behavior is early execution, I'm like 100% sure it should be in data order, because it's weird, especially since all the content on internet saying like you should use data order, and when like by default it's not working. Default library from GraphQL Foundation doesn't work with another default library from GraphQL Foundation in default mode, which is
No, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, you could say, okay, main GraphQL had the n+1 problem solved by utility data loader. You know, incremental GraphQL has a different problem solved by a different utility. You know.
Imagine the story. Person have like a server. He have like finally, and bear in mind, we like really deep into GraphQL story because we used and learned it for like years and work on it. And in customer land right now, it's like early majority. So previously it was early adopters, some enterprise company and some companies just switching to it. So I'm thinking we need to also bear in mind that for some people data order would be a new thing. And
yeah, wherever it goes, like that's a specific that I'm not like really concerned about. But like I think like the takeaway here is that data loader has this problem and we're able to solve it. And we're able to solve it, and it does, we don't have to do deferred execution to solve this problem with data loader.
Yeah. And API would look like more or less look like that. Where with API lives, it's like, it's implementation.
That's a specific that we can figure out when things are further along. All right. Yeah, so like I said, I'm going to cancel next week's meeting. So I'll see you all maybe at the working group on the Thursday after that, or maybe the Monday after that. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.